Our reading this morning is from 2 Corinthians 11, verses 16 to 33. 2 Corinthians 11, verses 16 to 33. I repeat, let no one think me foolish, but even if you do, accept me as a fool, so that I too may boast a little. What I'm saying with this boastful confidence, I say not as the Lord would, but as a fool. Since many boast according to the flesh, I too will boast. For you gladly bear with fools, being wise yourselves. For you bear it if someone makes slaves of you, or devours you, or takes advantage of you, or puts on airs, or strikes you in the face. To my shame, I must say, we were too weak for that. But whatever anyone else dares to boast of, I'm speaking as a fool, I also dare to boast of that. Are they Hebrews? So am I. Are they Israelites? So am I. Are they offspring of Abraham? So am I. Are they servants of Christ? I am a better one. I'm talking like a madman, with far greater labors, far more imprisonments, with countless beatings, and often near death. 5 times I received at the hand of the Jews the 40 lashes minus 1. 3 times I was beaten with rods. Once I was stoned. 3 times I was shipwrecked. A night and a day I was adrift at sea. On frequent journeys, in danger from rivers, danger from robbers, danger from my own people, danger from Gentiles, danger in the city, danger in the wilderness, danger at sea, danger from false brothers. In toil and hardship, through many a sleepless night, in hunger and thirst, often without food, in cold and exposure. And apart from other things, there is the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for all the churches. Who is weak? Am I not weak? Who is made to fall? Am I not indignant? If I must boast, I will boast of the things that show my weakness. The God and Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, he who is blessed forever, knows that I am not lying. At Damascus, the governor under King Aretas was guarding the city of Damascus in order to seize me, but I was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Last week, as we started, I expressed some concern that maybe Enoch, our student minister, shouldn't be listening to the sermons so that he didn't pick up any of my bad preaching habits. This week, my concern is a little bit different. As Enoch is considering going into the ministry, in the text today, we have the list of all of the things that Paul had to endure because he was in the ministry. So Enoch, I hope you're not discouraged as you look at the list of what Paul had to suffer as a minister. It doesn't mean that you'll go through all the same stuff when you're in ministry. But there's actually a vital leadership lesson in today's text. Paul's approach about boasting in our text today reminds me of something that Debbie's Uncle Ed once did at a leadership conference. Several of you, I think, who follow Facebook saw the tribute that I posted to Debbie's Uncle Ed on my Facebook page last fall, shortly after he'd passed away. Ed was one of my inspirations, one of my mentors when I started teaching the Bible. Ed worked hard as a high school teacher for many decades. He taught business ed, typing, and a couple of things in a high school, but he spent his evenings and his weekends teaching the Bible, leading Bible studies, and preaching in several congregations that couldn't afford to have a full-time pastor. Ed also taught the Bible at summer camps and conferences and several nursing homes. We talked about tent making last week and about Paul was making tents so that he could preach and do ministry. Well, Ed was a great tent maker. He was a great example. He worked as a high school teacher to pay the bills, pay the mortgage, and buy groceries, but he spent the time that he really loved preaching and teaching the Word of God. And he worked really hard at mastering the text of the Bible so that he could teach it really simply and plainly to children and to adults in ways that were just clear and memorable. And I've always striven to try and do that as well as he did. I remember on a Sunday morning, as Debbie and I were traveling, we had a chance to hear Uncle Ed preach in this little Baptist church in the Eastern Townships. There was just a half a dozen people in the congregation. And when we got there, I discovered that he was taking this little congregation through the book of Ezekiel. I got to tell you, I'm scared to read the book of Ezekiel alone at home. And here was Ed teaching the book of Ezekiel to these children and these old ladies in this little church. And he did that with a sense of humility and approachability and clarity that were just irresistible. Anyway, at one of the churches where Ed was preaching, there was a young man who was growing in his faith, and he was slowly learning to lead Bible studies. And Ed decided to take him along to a preachers and pastors conference. He thought the young man would be encouraged. And Tom, the young man, is the one who told me the story about Ed. And as the conference began on the first day, they had a time of prayer. And all these preachers and teachers and elders, and they're all in a big room together about to begin the conference. And the animator decided to go around the room. They would share prayer requests so that they could pray for each other. And sadly, as often happens when pastors and preachers get together, they were sharing prayer requests, but there was a lot of boasting going on when they shared prayer requests. One gentleman, he was leading 8 Bible studies in 3 different churches that were growing like crazy. And one other pastor was asking for prayer support because he had 2 new church plants in this city that were thriving and really successful. And one gentleman complained that he was in such demand, he was driving all over the city and he was running his car into the ground, and soon he was going to need a new car because his ministry was going so well and he was in so much demand. And Tom said that as it went around the circle and it got closer and closer to him, he started sweating and feeling increasingly embarrassed, wondering what he was doing there in the middle of all these Billy Grahams and these big-name preachers, and all these churches and these ministries were sounding bigger and bigger and better and larger as he went around. And Tom worried that when it came to him, what he did was just so insignificant. He just led this little Bible study, but he realized that Ed was getting restless too. Ed really didn't like show-offs. He didn't like all this boasting and bragging. When it was finally Tom's turn, with fear and trembling, he explained that he was just starting out. He was a new Christian, and once or twice a month, he just got to lead this little Bible study with 3 or 4 guys in his living room in his house. He was almost embarrassed to share that that's all he did. And then when it was Ed's turn, Ed was quiet for a minute. And Ed said, well, I just kind of helped Tom. Ed didn't want to talk about all the Bible studies and the preaching and the stuff he did. He wasn't into that boasting. Tom says he never forgot that lesson in humility. This great preacher, this great man of God, Ed, in public. He said, I'll just help lead this Bible study. One of the challenges we've got when we read the text today is that you can't see Paul's body language, and you can't hear his tone of voice. You just see his words. We can't actually see the way Paul must have been shifting uncomfortably in his seat while these fake apostles who thought they were really something breezed into town, and they started bragging about their credentials just to impress people so that then they could take advantage of them. I mean, for starters, we noted last week these shysters came into town. They looked really good. Nice Armani suits, shined shoes. They were slick and fashionable. They knew how to talk, how to impress people. They had the lingo down pat. They were really smooth. Probably rehearsed their speech in front of the mirror with a pencil in their mouth for their diction. And they were so smooth, in fact, that they were taking advantage of people. And people either didn't notice that they were being taken or they didn't mind because these guys were so smooth. And you know, this is a style of leadership that's been the rage in the secular world around us for a long time. These strong take-charge leaders, they breeze in, they impress everybody with the strength of their personality, tell you what to do, and they tell you how much money you're going to give them. They tell everybody to jump, and everybody says, how high? And you know, the strange thing is that most people accept that. We are so starved for leadership. We're so starved for a sense of direction that when somebody comes in who seems to know what they're doing, who's got a loud mouth and a nice way of talking, we'll do whatever they tell us as long as they'll tell us what to do, and we'll follow them anywhere. And we even let them take advantage of us. Paul says that when these false apostles arrived in Corinth, they started bossing people around, and he uses pretty strong language. In the Greek, he uses the word for slaves. He says, they've made slaves of you. They're treating you like slaves. He says they devoured people. They're taking advantage of you. And it probably refers to the way they took people's money. They were devouring people's livelihoods. They were doing these big offerings and collecting all this money and getting rich in the process. They put on airs, Paul says. And they struck people in the face. It's probably not literal. I'm guessing if they came around the church and started slapping people around, somebody would have said something. So it's a euphemism for embarrassing people. They breezed in with their noses in the air and said, oh, look at you guys. You're nothing. Well, we know what we're doing, but you guys, you know. And these false apostles had been so forceful, so aggressive, so over the top, so in your face, that in comparison, when Paul walks in showing real leadership, real caring, pastoral, tender-hearted leadership, the Corinthians had gotten so used to being abused and taken advantage of by these other apostles that when Paul walked in, they thought there was something wrong with Paul. What's wrong with this weakling? Why is he so soft-spoken? Why isn't he yelling at us? Why doesn't he want our money? They thought these other guys who were taking advantage of them were normal, and something was wrong with Paul. And Paul couldn't believe they fell for it. Paul says, if you guys are so wise, if you're so smart, why'd you let these fraudsters walk all over you? Don't you see what they're doing? I'm so glad that in the secular world around us, there's been a gradual shift in our understanding of leadership. I'm still working my way through one of the latest leadership books, one of the best books I've read for a long time. It's by a man called Simon Sinek, and it's called Leaders Eat Last. Leaders Eat Last. The last big leadership book he wrote was called Start With Why. I thought that one was interesting. He suggested that sometimes when we try and figure out what to do, we focus so much on the details, we lose our motivation and our steam. He says, when you've decided you need to go through a brick wall, the details don't matter. When you know why you need to get through that brick wall, you eventually do it, no matter how much effort it takes, because you know why you're doing what you're doing. And in his book called Leaders Eat Last, he notes that in the old British military system, when it was mealtime, the officers, the high-ranking guys, they would go to these fancy private dining halls, and they were served on fancy bone china and silverware by servants and waiters and call staff. And once the officers were done eating the fancy meal, at some point, if there was time and food left over, the ordinary enlisted men, they would fend for themselves at the back of the cafeteria somewhere with their dirty steel aluminum trays and the cracked plastic dishes, usually a different menu. Sinek was startled when he spent time with the U.S. Marines. He wanted to see why the Marines worked so well as a team, why they were such a close-knit team, and why they trusted their leaders so much. And he went to see the U.S. Marines, and on the first day, he gets to the first meal, and he was shocked. He walked into this big dining room, and all the officers were there with the enlisted men. He says, wait, where's the special dining room for the... Oh, no, they eat with us. Okay, do they get a special... No, they eat the same thing the enlisted men eat. And then when it was mealtime, he was shocked. Everybody lined up, but the enlisted men went first. In fact, the lowest guys in the rank ate first, and all the officers ate last, ending with the highest ranking officer in the room. If there was any food left at the end of the line, the highest ranking officer in the room got to eat whatever was left. That's leadership. That's the leadership that Paul practiced. In contrast to the Apostle Paul, who had come to Corinth on his own dime, paying his own way, in humility and weakness to see whether there was some way he could help the Corinthians, these fake apostles had breezed in. They started grabbing for themselves whatever they could take, taking advantage for their own benefit of everything they could get their hands on. Now, as Paul boasted a little bit, there's a little theology at stake. Paul was preaching a message that didn't sit well with most of the Jewish community. He was proclaiming Jesus as the Messiah who had fulfilled the law and ushered in a period of grace. Redemption now isn't something that you earn by working hard at keeping the law. In fact, says Paul, there's no way you can ever keep the law, so give up on trying that. Redemption was something you receive purely by grace, through faith, by placing your trust in the Messiah who had been crucified by the Romans. That was offensive to the Jews. It was offensive on so many levels. These fake Jewish apostles had come from Jerusalem. They wanted you to keep working hard at the law. You can do it. Come on. It's in you. And they had twisted Jesus' message around. Jesus wasn't here to free you from the burden of the law. He came to show you how to keep the law so that you can please God by your good works on your own steam with a little help from Jesus. And yeah, well, it's too bad Jesus was crucified. We don't talk about that too much. It's not a nice part of the story. But that's not what Jesus was about. He wants you to lead a happy, successful life. So these fake apostles, they didn't like Paul's message about a suffering, crucified Messiah. So they wanted to discredit him. So they're saying, well, this Paul, he doesn't really know what he's talking about. I mean, this Paul, we're not even sure he's really Jewish. I mean, he wasn't born in Jerusalem, He was born in Tarsus, out in the middle of a Roman province somewhere. He didn't even grow up in Jerusalem. I mean, we don't even know exactly how often he came to the temple. Wasn't even raised in Israel. How Jewish can he be? How much can he really know about the Messiah? So when Paul begins to counter the way the false apostles were boasting and bragging about their credentials, he needs to establish a couple of things. Look, I'm a Hebrew. I'm an Israelite. I'm a descendant of Abraham. Don't worry about that. I'm a good Jew. I know what I'm talking about. But then his tone changes. And you need to follow this closely because Paul uses words to set up a contrast between him and these other false apostles, these other teachers, these fraudsters who were taking advantage of people. In fact, right from the start, it turns on what I think is an interesting play on words. It's a sort of a double entendre in verse 23. Paul says, are they servants of Christ? I am a better one, says Paul. Paul uses the word diakonai Christou. The Greek word servant, diakonai, is the source of our English word for deacon. The members of our board of managers, our treasurers, all those who work at helping the church in the practical ways, the stevedant at the soundboard, the piano, all of these, they're diakonai, deacons. They are servants of the church. So Paul is already setting up a sharp contrast with these high and mighty false apostles who were so full of themselves that they thought they were the bosses of the church. Paul says, listen, you're not the bosses of the church. You're the servants of the church. Diakonai, servants of Christ. You don't come here wearing a three-piece suit and a tie. You come here wearing an apron and work clothes. And the way these two words are put together, grammatically, Paul actually says two things, I think. Not just that he is a servant of Christ, but that he is a Christ servant. A servant not only that belongs to Christ, but a servant to serve the way Christ served. I'm a Jesus servant. I'm a Christ servant. Not just I'm a servant of Christ, but I serve the way Christ served. I'm a Christ-like servant. I'm a Jesus type of servant. So that as Paul lays out his resume, as he lists the sufferings and the difficulties and the troubles and the pain that he has faced, if you look at it in human terms, it sounds like a long list of failures. You think, what's wrong with this guy? Anybody that's had this much trouble in his career, obviously something's off. But these weren't things to be ashamed of. Paul saw himself as continuing the service of Christ to the church. He was continuing to serve the church just as Christ had done at the cost of his own life and his own comfort, at great personal cost, often at the risk of his life. The bottom line is this, Paul says. This is how you can tell the difference between these false apostles and me. When these guys came to town, they took advantage of you and they abused you. I've done the reverse. For your sake, I've allowed others to take advantage of me. For your benefit, I have personally suffered and accepted abuse. Not only have I not been hitting anybody, I've let other people hit me. These false apostles, they've hit you and struck you in the face. I've allowed myself to be hit for you with the beating rods of the Roman authorities after trials before the justice system. 3 times with the 40 lashes minus 1 of the Jewish whip meted out by the local synagogues when Paul got in trouble with Jewish congregations. He was hit by the rocks thrown by those who stoned him in Lystra and left him for dead. And in the long list of hardships he's endured, Paul actually makes what appears to be a grammatical error in verse 27. But it's one of those very significant intentional grammatical mistakes in the Bible. Paul explains that through the difficult process of serving the churches, there were moments where he just plain ran out of money. There's no money to buy new clothes. He was cold and destitute. He had to make do with worn-out shoes and tattered cloaks as he traveled from city to city. And there were also moments when he was short of food. The food ran out. Now, in Greek as in English, there are different words to express what happens when you don't eat. That explains why you're not eating. And there are several words that would have been appropriate in this context that express hunger or starvation. I was starving. I was hungry. being short of food simply because you don't have food to eat. But Paul doesn't use any of these. He uses the word that's usually used for fasting. And fasting is a self-imposed not eating. It's not obligatory. This makes no sense. You know, if your fridge is full, if you have money for groceries, if there's food in the cupboard and you're not eating, then you're fasting. You've made the decision not to eat. You could eat, but you've made the decision not to. But if the cupboards are bare, the fridge is empty, you have nothing to eat, and you don't have any money for more groceries, then technically you're not fasting. You're starving. You're out of food. But Paul wants to make the point that while he wasn't eating because there was no food, it wasn't an imposed deprivation. He had chosen that. He had made choices of his own will that had led him to the point where there was nothing to eat. He had chosen this when he decided to follow Jesus Christ in ministry. He had chosen this when he accepted the call to preach Christ, not in the big cities with big supportive Jewish communities that could take care of him with all kinds of money, but to serve Christ in the remote Gentile cities of the Roman Empire, where he had to fend for himself because there was nobody to support him. He had chosen this when he came to Corinth, and he refused to take their money because it was tainted. And for the sake of the gospel, he preferred to go hungry so that the message wouldn't be compromised or misunderstood if he took all of these big speaking honorariums we talked about last week. So while the apostles, the false apostles, were lying awake at night trying to figure out how to get even wealthier on the backs of the people they were supposed to be serving, over and above all the hardships, when Paul was staying awake at night, lying, twisting, and turning in bed, worried and concerned, he wasn't concerned about how to get wealthier and how to take more advantage of them. He was concerned about their welfare, about what more he could do for them, about whether they were doing okay, about whether they would make it, about whether they would persevere in the faith. The false apostles had breezed into town and abused the Corinthians, slapped them around so that they could take advantage of them, get wealthy on their backs. In stark contrast, Paul had accepted to suffer abuse himself for their sake. Rather than trying to find ways to enrich himself from his ministry to them, Paul had chosen hunger and poverty so that the Corinthians might be enriched by the gospel. I hope some of this is sounding familiar. A couple chapters ago, back in 2 Corinthians 8:9, Paul reminds the Corinthians of this. He says, "You know the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ. Though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you through his poverty might become rich." So you know how you can tell a real servant of Christ? Do you know how you can tell a real diakonoi Christou? Two things. First, their ministry is about Christ. It's not about themselves. And secondly, they serve in the same way that Christ did, in the same spirit of self-sacrifice, accepting hardship and suffering for the sake of Christ, for the sake of those he calls them to serve on his behalf. The text we read this morning has a couple of weird things about it. One of the strangest things is that Paul ends the list of his sufferings with a really strange story about the way Paul was snuck out of the city of Damascus, being lowered over the city wall in a basket. And you read this text and you go, what? What in the world is this about? And of all the long list of sufferings that Paul went through, why does he end with this weird story? Let me tell you why. The Romans were very, very big on military decorations and medals for valor and for courage and for great military exploits. They loved giving out medals to their soldiers and to their citizens. There was the very prestigious Corona Gramine, the grass crown, the highest and rarest of all military decorations, ironically woven together of a special kind of grass. It was presented to a ranking officer whose actions had saved an entire legion or a portion of the army. Sometimes the general at the front would make a decision that would save thousands of lives of his men. He was presented this grass crown. Some of them were awards given to citizens. Occasionally a citizen might be awarded the Corona Civica. It's Latin for the civic crown. It wasn't made out of grass, it was made out of oak leaves that were woven together to form a crown, and it was awarded to somebody who had saved the lives of fellow Roman citizens. A couple of months ago, there's a gentleman on the carry overpass. As he was driving by, he saw somebody on the fence who was going through a rough time and was going to jump onto the traffic below. He hopped out of his car, he held him back, pulled him back, and he held him until the police came. And he was given an award, rightly so, because he'd saved the life of a fellow citizen. This was the Corona Civica. This is the award you were given if you saved the life of another citizen. But there were some very impressive military awards that were given. I like the Corona Navalis, the naval crown. It wasn't made of grass or oak leaves. It was made out of gold. And it was awarded to the first man who boarded an enemy ship during a naval engagement. When the Romans went to sea, and they did battle at sea quite often, so with their ship and the battering ram on the ship, they would try and get the enemy ship in their sights, and then they would zero in, and they would force themselves up to the next ship. They would fasten the two ships together, and then the soldiers would hop from the Roman ship onto the other ship and start hand-to-hand combat. Now, you got to know that when you do that, the first couple guys who jump onto the other ship, you're risking your life. You need kahunas to do this. And so to encourage their soldiers to do that, to grapple and to hop onto the other ship, they would give a medal to the first man who had the nerve to jump onto the other ship. So you know what happened to the soldiers? They all wanted this award. They wanted this medal. And so when the two ships came together, the two ships had hardly touched it right away. There would be a contest among the guys who had the most bravado and the most testosterone to see who would be the first one to jump on the other ship, because that one would get the medal, the Corona Navalis. But there was another medal that was even more valuable, and it was even a little rarer. And it wasn't about naval combat, it was about land battles. When there was a siege, that was always very frustrating to the Romans, because the Romans liked to do things quickly. When they took over a city, they liked to move in, bang, bang, crash the walls, they're in, they're out, city's ours, move on, next city. But sometimes the siege would last for weeks and months, like it did in the case of the city of Jerusalem. And for months, the Romans would camp around the city, and they'd batter the side of the walls with their rams, and they'd throw stuff at the wall, and they'd bang at the gates, and they'd try with hammers and stuff to dismantle the gates and try to get in, and they would have the ladders against the wall and try to climb up, and then people would dump oil and stuff on them as they tried to climb the walls, and this went on for months. And to encourage their soldiers to be brave and break the shield, at some point there would be one brave soldier who would finally succeed in getting over the wall with the ladders and the shield, and the guys would watch over him and they'd push him up, and finally there'd be one brave Roman guy who'd manage to get himself over the wall and inside the city. Now, I got to tell you, this is an award that was often done posthumously, because usually the first guy over didn't survive. But there was a reward for that. It was called the Corona Moralis, the wall crown, the Corona Moralis, one of the most prized decorations of the Roman military, worn with great pride and honor. It said, "We attacked the city, and when we got there, I was the first one in." So still very much tongue-in-cheek, Paul is bragging. I think Paul is bragging about his Corona Muralis. You know, some of the soldiers, Paul says, they got decorated because they were the first one in. I was the first one out over the wall at night in a wicker basket. He'd preached the gospel in Damascus. He'd taken the city by storm. In fact, he'd had such an impact on the city that all the Jews in the city who didn't believe in Jesus were so upset at him, they wanted to run him out of town. They wanted him dead. And he'd caused so much of an upheaval in the city that even the civil authorities were worried, and they were upset at him. So the Jewish leaders used their influence to try to get Paul arrested, and they wanted to get him put on trial for disturbing the peace, because on those grounds, Paul could have been executed. Now, the Roman authorities, King Aretas in Damascus, wouldn't have cared about this, disagreement of theology about who Jesus was, whether he was risen from the dead. He didn't care about that, but he cared about peace and order. And so the Jewish leaders, they'd gone to King Aretas and convinced him, this Paul guy, you need to get rid of him. He's trouble. He's no good. He's going to cause trouble in the empire. Sedition. He's going to cause riots. You need to. And so the king was looking for Paul. The city was tightly shut. They'd closed the gates, guards at each one of the exits. Couldn't get out, couldn't get in. And the soldiers have started searching house to house to house to house, trying to find out where Paul was, a building at a time. And time was running out. Eventually, they're going to find Paul and have him killed. So the friends had to help him escape. Under the cover of darkness, they went to one of the houses that was built along the edge of the wall, some of the houses that would be built up inside along the wall, and they would have windows that gave outside the city wall. So they snuck Paul into one of these houses. They put him in a big wicker basket, maybe hidden with a lid on it or blankets in it. And with ropes, they lowered him down on the outside of the city wall. There he was, big man, big apostle, high and mighty, important man for the gospel. His claim to fame, his medal, it wasn't that he had courageously been the first one over the city wall with a sword in hand as a military hero to take the city over with a Roman medal to hang on his wall at home. His claim to fame was that he'd so faithfully preached the gospel. He had been so forthright in proclaiming Christ that he'd had to flee for his life, hidden in a basket under the cover of darkness. This was not exactly a Corona Morales medal on Paul's resume. If there was an opposite medal of the Corona, that's the medal Paul would have had. You know, I'm often deeply concerned about the way we preach the gospel these days. Your life is a mess. You need some direction. Your business is failing. Your wife doesn't like you anymore. Your kids won't talk to you. Well, come to Jesus. He'll fix all your problems. He'll make sure your business is successful. He'll give you a fancy house with 2 nice cars in the garage. He'll make your kids obey you, and he'll even make your wife prettier. One of these days, I'd love to hear somebody preach the gospel the way Paul did, the way Jesus did. If your life is empty and pointless, it's not because you need Jesus to give you more stuff. It's because you're wasting your life on stupid stuff that doesn't matter. Why don't you try spending your life on something really worthwhile? Come and do something hard for God. After Paul is thrown off his horse by the bright light of the vision of Jesus on the Damascus road, the Lord sends poor Ananias to talk to him. And God tells Ananias, this is what you're going to tell Paul. Go tell him he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. It's funny, you remember how Jesus worded his invitation to the disciples? It's an invitation that we don't often use in gospel crusades anymore. Jesus said, come, start up your Cadillac, and come and follow me. You know what he said? Come, take up your cross, follow me. This is exactly what Paul was doing, in sharp contrast to the other fake apostles who were in it for what they could get out of it. And so we spend our lives pointlessly spinning our wheels, looking for fame, looking for fortune, boasting about our accomplishments, padding our CV, because we think this will bring us fulfillment and happiness. But Jesus calls us to a life that really matters, a life that really counts, a life self-sacrificially invested in serving Christ, proclaiming the gospel, building his church. I wonder this morning whether you have the courage to try something hard for God. I wonder what your Corona Morales will look like. Amen. Father, thank you for the high calling that was Paul's. Thank you that he followed through. We have much of the New Testament because of Paul's courage in following you in his selfless work. Father, who knows the contribution that we will make as we come to you, as we follow your lead, as we become diakonai Christou, Christ servants. Make us that, we pray. In his name, amen.